The register beeped 3 times, a sharp, high-pitched failure that cut through the mundane supermarket noise like a siren. My 72-year-old hands, usually steady, fumbled with the card as the cashier, a teenage girl whose expression shifted instantly from bored politeness to impatient scrutiny, repeated the total. "Declined, ma'am. Do you have another card?" The sudden rush of heat to my neck wasn't just embarrassment. It was visceral. Confusion. This was my main account, the joint savings I had meticulously built over 40 years of teaching history to indifferent teenagers. It held the sum of my life, the down payment for the small house, the emergency fund, and the modest retirement savings meant to keep me comfortable until the end. "That can't be right," I heard myself whisper, my voice cracking slightly. I knew the balance was healthy. I had checked it just last week, a necessary routine for an independent widow. I tried again, pressing the plastic into the chip reader with unnecessary force, willing the transaction to go through. The machine mocked me again. "Transaction failed. Contact bank." In that agonizing minute, while the line behind me grew restless and I felt the weight of every judging stare, I convinced myself it was a technical glitch, an ATM machine eating a card or a temporary network outage. Handed the cashier a crumpled $20 bill from my purse for the small bag of groceries, gathering my dignity around me like a fragile shawl. I walked out into the cold afternoon air, the humiliation stinging, but the deeper seed of anxiety had just been planted. I still believed it was an inconvenience. I had no idea this public mortification was merely the first tiny tremor before the mountain of my life collapsed entirely. I didn't know then that the price I was about to pay wasn't just losing my money, but losing the fundamental faith I had placed in the one person who mattered most. My life, until that moment, was defined by quiet dependability. I was Eleanor Vance, a woman who measured her success not by luxury but by stability. I lived in the same reliable brick ranch house my husband Robert and I had bought 40 years prior, maintained a pristine garden, and kept a schedule that rarely deviated. I was the person neighbors called when they needed a recommendation for a good plumber or a shoulder to cry on. My greatest achievement, the culmination of every sacrifice and late night spent grading papers, was my son, Daniel. Daniel was my universe. After Robert passed away 5 years ago, Daniel became my anchor. He was 45, successful in his consulting career, and always presented himself as the dutiful son. It was Daniel who had insisted with such convincing earnestness that we make the primary checking and savings accounts joint for continuity, Mom. You know, in case anything ever happens to you, I can manage everything without probate headaches. I had resisted initially. I was a private woman, but his argument was sound, practical, and laced with filial concern. I trusted him implicitly. He was my blood, my heir, and the custodian of my peace of mind. I drove straight home, the half-eaten loaf of bread resting on the passenger seat, the feeling of wrongness festering in my stomach. The account in question wasn't just a simple checking account. It held the bulk of Robert's life insurance payout, money that represented his final loving guarantee of my security. That money meant I would never be a burden. That money was my freedom. I pulled the car into the driveway, the normalcy of the quiet street and the familiar scent of wood smoke from Mr. Henderson's chimney serving as a stark contrast to the rapidly accelerating dread in my chest. I sat there, the engine ticking as it cooled, needing to call the bank immediately, needing to hear a voice confirm it was all a stupid, temporary error, so I could return to my quiet, dependable life, the life I had worked my entire existence to secure. I finally picked up the phone, my fingers slick against the cool glass screen. The bank's automated system offered a nauseatingly cheerful menu. I bypassed the prompts, stammering until a human voice, crisp and aggressively neutral, finally answered. I gave my name, my account number, and choked out the question about the missing liquidity. There was a long digitized pause on the line, punctuated by the rhythmic static of 1,000 unanswered questions. When the woman returned, her voice was low, professional, and entirely devoid of human empathy. "Mr. Hayes," she began, using my formal name, which immediately signaled the gravity of the situation. I show that a significant withdrawal was executed from your primary investment fund 2 days ago. It was an authorized liquidation, signed and verified. My world tilted. Authorized? No, that's impossible. I didn't authorize anything. I need you to reverse it immediately. It must be a clerical error. The dread was now a physical fist squeezing my diaphragm. She repeated the facts with the unwavering certainty of a computer output. The signature matched the file. The transfer was initiated via a specialized offshore trust vehicle, designated by you in the ancillary paperwork last month. Offshore trust, ancillary paperwork. I hadn't signed any paperwork, ancillary or otherwise, in 6 months. I was meticulous. So about documentation. I was documentation. I demanded the name of the recipient trust, but she became suddenly guarded, citing privacy regulations and instructing me to contact my financial advisor directly. She hung up with a clinical, "Have a good day," leaving me gripping the dead phone, the sound of the dial tone echoing louder than my own frantic breathing. The quiet, dependable life I had worked my existence to secure was not merely threatened. It had been surgically removed. It wasn't an error, it was deliberate. The realization that someone had actively moved against me, using my own meticulous system as the weapon, was a far deeper shock than the financial loss itself. I finally pushed the car door open, the wood smoke scent now smelling of decay and deceit. Walking into the house, I expected the familiar, sterile order. Instead, a foreign object sat on the hall table, dominating the space where I usually dropped my keys. It was a new piece of luggage, a sleek Italian leather duffel bag, the kind favored by people who catch private jets. It wasn't ours. My partner, David, was pragmatic, almost aggressively so, about travel gear. He owned one well-worn, sensible canvas backpack. This duffel was supple, expensive, and smelled faintly of expensive cologne and, strangely, sea salt. A cold shaft of suspicion, sharp and immediate, pierced through the financial panic. Why would David buy this? He hadn't mentioned a trip. He'd been home, supposedly working on a complex contract all week. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they traced the embossed initials on the silver clasp, DA. The dread now had a specific human target. I picked up my phone again and called David's work number. It went straight to voicemail, the recording saying he was in meetings all week and to contact his assistant, Melissa. I called Melissa. Her tone was tight, rehearsed. "Oh, Mr. Hayes, David is traveling this week, quite unexpectedly. He said it was a necessary trip for the contract, very high stakes. He took a red-eye flight out Tuesday morning." Tuesday morning, the morning after the unauthorized transfer was finalized. I stood there, holding a bag reeking of the sea, listening to a voice confirm he'd vanished the moment my life savings had. He hadn't been working from home. He had been arranging his departure. He had looked me in the eye Monday night, discussed the grocery list, and knew, even then, that he was packing a bag he wouldn't return with. The urge to throw the duffel against the wall was immense, but a colder, more calculated instinct took over. I needed proof. I didn't want to confront him with a gut feeling. I needed to confront him with an arsenal. I unzipped the Italian leather. The contents were sparse but devastating. No clothes, just a scattering of receipts. The first was a rental agreement for a large, anonymous storage unit located 40 miles away, near the coastal airport David claimed he never used. The second was a business card for a high-end jeweler in Monte Carlo, tucked into a small velvet pouch. Inside the pouch, nestled on the soft lining, was not a ring, but a single folded piece of paper, a notarized document in French which, despite my rusty college knowledge, I recognized immediately. It was a purchase agreement for an offshore property signed by D. Allen, David's middle name, which he rarely used, and witnessed by someone I terrifyingly recognized, the name of the obscure specialized trust vehicle the bank officer had refused to disclose. The betrayal was complete. It wasn't just the money. It was the careful performance of normalcy, the quiet, dependable life that had been a theatrical stage for his calculated robbery. He hadn't just stolen my future. He had meticulously dismantled my reality, leaving behind only the cold, expensive leather of a liar's souvenir. I dropped the duffel. The silence in the house was no longer peaceful. It was the chilling, echoing silence of a tomb. I was alone, and I was financially erased, staring down at the tangible evidence of a sophisticated, years-long deception I hadn't even known I was surviving. The immediate shock of the duffel bag discovery gave way to a chilling, surgical clarity. I didn't break down. I didn't scream for the neighbors to hear. That would have been an emotional reaction, and emotions were a luxury I could no longer afford. He had treated my life like a complex accounting entry, and now I needed to find the corresponding debit, the source code of the operation. My focus shifted instantly from the living room where my future lay crumpled on the imported wool rug to his sterile, meticulously organized home office. I walked past the mahogany desk, a fortress he had used to hide his campaign of dismantling me. The entire room smelled faintly of expensive leather and that specific, terrifying scent of unassailable order. Everything was labeled, categorized and filed with the precision of a man who trusted systems more than people. I ignored the binders marked joint investments and estate planning. Those were the elaborate props of his performance. I needed the misfile, the single chaotic variable that proved the human element still existed. I started pulling drawers, not gently searching, but ripping through the expensive veneer, my fingers hunting for an anomaly. It wasn't in the locked safe, nor in the detailed quarterly reports. It was tucked deep into the back of a shallow stationery drawer, behind a stack of unused printer paper and a manual for a blender we hadn't owned in 5 years, a single folded train ticket stub. It was cheap, thin thermal paper, weeks old, and the destination printed clearly across its faded surface was Silverwood Heights. The sight of it stopped my breath colder than the empty bank statements ever could. This was the first true psychological breach. The financial fraud was massive but abstract. This was intimate and physical. He despised public transit. He flew business class even for domestic puddle jumps. Yet here was proof of a 2-hour commuter journey taken on a Tuesday afternoon, a time he claimed to be finalizing the deal of the century in a glass tower downtown. More jarring than the destination was the absence of the expense. This journey hadn't been billed, recorded, or justified. It was a ghost journey executed solely for his private benefit. I pressed the brittle ticket flat against the desktop. Silverwood Heights was a distant, unremarkable suburban sprawl, known only for its cheap land and long commutes, the exact opposite of the exclusive, central life he had insisted we maintain. I remembered the conversation vividly. 6 months ago, I had mentioned an acquaintance who moved there, and he had dismissed the entire locale with a sneering 2-sentence monologue about the inherent vulgarity of long driveways and strip malls. His revulsion hadn't been aesthetic. It had been a carefully constructed shield. He hadn't been avoiding a place he disliked. He had been shielding a secret familiarity. The train ticket wasn't about money. It was about reconnaissance. He hadn't just been draining our accounts. He had been physically mapping out his exit strategy, establishing a low-profile anchor point outside the glittering, expensive cage he had built for me. This was the blueprint for the life he planned to lead once I was fully excavated. It solidified the terrifying realization: the financial theft was just the foundation for a complete emotional and geographical abandonment. The Silverwood Heights stub was the first unfair sign that the betrayal extended far beyond the ledger, confirming that every shared moment over the last several years had been a calculated distraction while he quietly packed his bags for a completely separate reality. The silence in the house, previously a comfort, now felt like a pressurized vacuum. I moved through our shared spaces not as a resident, but as a forensic investigator tracing a crime scene. I had sealed the Silverwood stub inside a waterproof bag, a physical anchor of the deceit. But anchors only keep things still. They don't tell you where the ship has sailed. My next move had to be surgical, avoiding any digital footprint he might track. I bypassed his banking app. The ledgers were messy and slow, and went straight for the hidden archives, the collaborative cloud drive where we stored old tax documents, renovation plans, and shared memories. It was a place designed for joint accountability and therefore the perfect place to hide the evidence of unilateral planning. I wasn't looking for transactional proof of infidelity, I was looking for proof of a life. I searched for recent files attached to Silverwood, and the algorithm, cruelly efficient, highlighted a recently created heavily encrypted folder labeled simply HWOG14. It wasn't the name of a business venture or a property code. It was an acronym that chilled me far more than any spreadsheet ever could. Housewarming. The date was 2 weeks ago. A Saturday afternoon he had claimed to spend at a mandatory, tedious golf charity event for his biggest client, Richard. Accessing the folder required the secondary password we swore never to use for casual files, the name of our first shared dog, now long deceased. The fact that he used the most sacred, private piece of our history to protect his new one was a calculated obscenity. Inside, there wasn't a spreadsheet or a contract, but a gallery of high-resolution digital photographs, perfectly framed and professionally shot. This was not a quick snapshot. This was documentation of a milestone, meticulously curated for viewing. The first picture was an aerial shot of a beautifully landscaped backyard, sun-drenched, featuring a sleek, minimalist pool design, clearly a brand new construction in Silverwood Heights, far beyond the means he had repeatedly claimed we possessed. But it was the faces that stopped my heart. Richard, the client he was supposedly boring on the golf course, was there, laughing. So were 3 other couples we knew professionally. People who had always been polite but distant, suddenly looking relaxed and intimately familiar with him. They were all dressed in resort casual attire, sipping bespoke cocktails, all part of a social circle I had been systematically excluded from, without ever realizing I was missing anything. Then came the punch that shattered the remaining glass shell of my composure. A wide shot of a group gathered near a massive outdoor kitchen. He was positioned centrally, his arm resting casually on the shoulder of a woman I recognized faintly, Vanessa, one of the newer architects at his firm. She was beaming up at him with an ease that spoke not of a brief encounter, but of shared comfortable history. The lighting was golden, the mood celebratory, and his smile, the wide, unrestrained, genuine smile he hadn't directed at me in years, the one he reserved for successful closings and private jokes, was blazing in her direction. The injustice wasn't just the presence of the woman, or the sophisticated party, or the lie about the golf. The sheer, suffocating betrayal was the joy. He wasn't miserable, stressed, or secretly planning his escape in agonizing silence. He was thriving. He was already living the life he had purchased with our stability, celebrating its beginning with people who clearly knew him in this new, successful, unburdened iteration, an iteration that simply did not include me. I wasn't a temporary inconvenience. I was already history, a faded draft he had quietly edited out of his future manuscript while I was still proofreading the cover page. The drive back was not fueled by rage, but by a chilling, surgical calm. I felt like a forensic scientist returning to a crime scene, except the victim and the perpetrator were both me. The house, usually a container of shared, reliable silence, now felt like a stage set for a play that had already closed, leaving the props untouched. The first place I looked was his study. Specifically, the top drawer of the mahogany desk, where he kept his important documents, passports, warranties, and the occasional tax receipt he was too lazy to file. I wasn't looking for a confession. I was looking for the blueprint. Beneath a stack of old conference pamphlets, I found it. A slim, embossed invoice from a boutique corporate law firm downtown, dated 7 months prior. The amount billed was astronomical, listed simply as consultation and strategy development. I knew the firm. They specialized in discrete high-net-worth dissolutions and complex asset restructuring. This wasn't about a new business venture. This was about building an impenetrable fortress around himself before he detonated the foundations of our life. 7 months. That meant he had been planning this new, joyful existence while we were still discussing remodeling the kitchen, while I was nursing him through his fabricated stress over work demands. I placed the receipt neatly on the blotter, the heavy cardstock feeling strangely delicate in my numb fingers. The air in the house grew thick with waiting. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the living room, surrounded by the ghosts of our compromised security, refusing to move. He finally called just after midnight, the phone screen flashing his name, the name of the traitor. His voice was low, coated. In a false concern I now recognized as performance. He said he was stuck late celebrating the big acquisition, claiming the flight back was delayed. He apologized profusely for missing our dinner, painting himself as the weary, dedicated provider. "Are you all right, darling?" he asked, the word darling ringing hollow like a dropped coin. "Perfectly fine," I replied, my voice steady, betraying nothing. I needed him to believe the stage was still set. I needed him to commit fully to the lie so I could measure the depth of his contempt. "Don't worry, just get some rest." The silence on my end was not emotional distance, it was tactical. He hung up satisfied, having checked the box of wifely duty. That night I didn't sleep. I just watched the clock spin, knowing the man I loved was actively building a life where I ceased to exist, and I had just given him the all clear. The receipt was the fuse. The next step had to be the bomb. The next morning, fueled by black coffee and cold resolve, I accessed the shared cloud storage using the archaic password he hadn't changed since college, a testament to his arrogance. I wasn't looking for pictures or texts, those were too messy. I went straight for the encrypted financial folders, the ones labeled Taxes 2024. Deep within, nested under layers of legitimate business spreadsheets, I found a folder named SP Drafts. My breath hitched, not from panic, but from the sudden, sharp ingestion of pure adrenaline. Inside were meticulously prepared drafts of a marital settlement agreement. They weren't just filed, they were dated, revised, and stamped with the logo of the same boutique law firm. The first draft was 8 months old. The latest revision, 3 weeks ago, was marked Final Review. The language was chillingly clinical. It outlined the division of assets, heavily favoring his new business entity, classifying the equity in our home as pre-marital investment due to a carefully backdated loan document I had vaguely signed months earlier, thinking it was related to refinancing. But the true gut punch wasn't the money. It was the section detailing the dissolution of our life insurance policies and shared accounts. He hadn't just filed for divorce. He had systematically, legally, and aggressively erased every single financial thread connecting us. He had created a legal fiction where our marriage was merely a brief, financially inconsequential interlude in his trajectory towards success. I scrolled down further, past the clauses about the dog and the furniture, and saw a schedule listing the projected closing date for the new property he was celebrating, a date 6 weeks from now. He wasn't leaving me. He had already left. The man I knew had died 8 months ago, and this new entity had been carefully maneuvering his corpse out of my shared existence, piece by expensive piece. The scale of the betrayal wasn't just infidelity. It was a sustained, calculated campaign of financial and emotional elimination. I realized, sitting there in the early morning light, that I wasn't married to a flawed man. I was married to a sophisticated, cold-blooded machine designed to optimize for self-interest. The silence had ended. The knowledge was now a heavy, concrete fact, demanding immediate and devastating action. The heavy weight of the knowledge translated immediately into meticulous, cold focus. I spent the next 72 hours existing solely in the digital underbelly of our life, my fingers flying across the glowing keyboard, tracing the intricate spiderweb of deceit he had woven. The initial shock had been replaced by a furious clinical need for documentation. I wasn't seeking comfort or confrontation. I was assembling a case file against a ghost. The first concrete item I found, buried deep within a remote server backup he used for work contracts, wasn't further proof of the affair. That evidence was already damning and complete. It was the finalized, executed paperwork for the transfer of the entire Cayman Trust. That held the bulk of our joint investment capital. The document showed the signing date was 6 months prior, executed with a sophisticated electronic signature that mirrored mine perfectly. He hadn't just depleted the account, he had quietly quarantined the entire portfolio, moving it into an irrevocable single-party holding. It wasn't just theft, it was preemptive financial surgery, designed to leave me alive, but hollowed out. That evening, he came home whistling a terrible, cheerful tune, smelling faintly of expensive cologne, and the smug certainty of a man who believed his secrets were safe. He kissed me on the forehead, a light, habitual peck, and asked about my day, his voice brimming with manufactured concern. He settled down in his armchair to review stock portfolios, casually mentioning a potential upcoming investment opportunity, the very portfolios that, according to the documents I just analyzed, were about to be dissolved into his offshore shell company within the fortnight. I cooked dinner, plated it with steady hands, and watched him eat. Every relaxed sigh, every casual observation about the flavor of the basil was an insult I swallowed whole. I said nothing. The silence was not empty. It was pressurized, humming with enough voltage to incinerate the room. He didn't notice the subtle shift in my eyes. He saw only the passive reflection he expected. It was a terrifying realization. I was living with a man capable of smiling and planning my ruin simultaneously, and his capacity for performance was flawless. This forced proximity, this mandatory theater of a happy marriage, was the deepest cut yet. It wasn't the loss of the money that hurt. It was having to act as the dutiful wife while knowing I was feeding my own executioner. I pressed further, into the digital archives, the lack of sleep sharpening my focus rather than dulling it. The Cayman transfer was the action. I needed the intention. I needed the origin point of the scheme. It wasn't the financial documents that finally made the air leave my lungs. It was a scanned invoice I found inside a forgotten folder labeled Tax Prep 2019. The invoice detailed a consultation fee for the office of Elias Thorne and Associates. Thorne wasn't just a lawyer. He was the notorious divorce reaper, known for brutally aggressive asset stripping. The date on the invoice shattered the timeline I had constructed in my mind. It was dated 3 years ago, 2 weeks before our destination wedding. The entire structure of our life together imploded in that instant. It wasn't an exit strategy conceived during a marriage gone wrong. It was the foundational blueprint. He hadn't decided to betray me during our marriage. He had married me as part of the execution phase of his plan. The realization hit like a physical blow. I hadn't been a wife. I had been an investment waiting to be liquidated, a temporary holding account until his machinery was ready to extract maximum value. The entire courtship, the vows, the shared future, it had all been a lie constructed to satisfy the legal requirements of an elaborate, cold-blooded fraud. This wasn't infidelity. This was pure, unadulterated predation, and the worst part was the sheer suffocating scale of its premeditation. I was dealing not with a husband, but with a meticulously constructed long-term enemy. The immediate suffocating panic had to be metabolized into rigid, cold action. I could not afford tears. Tears were a liability, a sign of weakness my enemy would exploit. The man sleeping beside me, if he truly slept, was a high-functioning sociopath with architectural precision. My first move was the establishment of absolute digital isolation. I purged my personal electronics of any app he might have insisted upon installing, changed every password to random strings I memorized using mnemonic systems he could never crack, and acquired a dedicated, untraceable burner phone, a piece of cheap, anonymous plastic that felt like a lifeline. This device, powered off and tucked into a waterproof pouch taped beneath the loose floorboard in my unused studio closet, became my silent war room. I began observing him with a clinical detachment that chilled me more than his betrayal. Every casual touch, every soft question about my day, every financial query he framed as concern was now passed through the lens of fraud analysis. I wasn't married to him. I was auditing him. I noted the specific times he stepped away, for urgent calls, always using an obscure, muffled voice, and the pattern of his solitary trips to the gym, which stretched precisely 90 minutes, enough time for a secure transaction or a meeting with his co-conspirators. The first physical breach occurred during one of these 90-minute windows. I didn't dare touch his locked safe. That was too obvious. Instead, I focused on things he considered innocuous or beneath my notice. I found it, nestled at the bottom of his ornate watch window box, hidden beneath the velvet lining. A miniature metallic USB drive, thinner than a credit card. It was so well concealed that retrieving it required the use of a sterilized dental pick to avoid leaving any discernible trace of disturbance on the velvet. The drive was encrypted, of course, requiring a password more complex than anything related to our shared life. But I remembered a careless comment he'd made months ago, a self-congratulatory remark about his security protocol being tied to the Nasdaq closing price on the day his first major company went public. It took 4 agonizing attempts, but the drive clicked open. The contents were digital cyanide, not explicit love letters which would have been easier to process, but spreadsheets, encrypted communication logs, and legal documents detailing 3 separate offshore trusts in the Caymans and the Channel Islands. My name appeared only once, listed not as a beneficiary but categorized under the column header, Assets for Redesignation upon Legal Event Trigger. The most devastating file, however, was a meticulously color-coded Gantt chart labeled Project Chimera Exit Strategy Phases 1 and 2. Phase 1 detailed the swift consolidation and transfer of liquid assets. Phase 2, scheduled to commence 90 days from the SAE. Current date, detailed the sale of the primary marital residence and the initiation of legal proceedings. The urgency of that 90-day countdown hit me like a physical blow. I had less than 3 months before he planned to execute the final, devastating move. The discovery immediately changed the temperature in our home. I couldn't look at him without seeing the predator calculating the kill. My silence was not born of confusion, but of pure, strategic necessity. When he asked, "Is everything all right, darling? You seem distant," I manufactured a flawless, tired smile and attributed my mood to stress at my own firm. His eyes, usually charming and open, contained a flicker of suspicion. He was testing the boundaries, checking if the wire was live. The sheer effort of maintaining this facade, of cooking his dinner, enduring his performance of intimacy, discussing banal weekend plans, was exhausting. I felt like an actress trapped in a stage play waiting for the prop gun to fire. Then came the second, deeper escalation. He initiated the process of selling the house immediately, 2 weeks earlier than the schedule on Project Chimera. He explained it away smoothly over breakfast, citing unforeseen market opportunities and the need for capital liquidity. He said we would rent something smaller, more intimate, while we decided on our permanent future. His sudden urgency confirmed that he felt the clock ticking, perhaps sensing my withdrawal, or perhaps simply seeing the opportunity to accelerate the liquidation phase. I pretended to agree enthusiastically, even helping him organize the initial paperwork for the realtor. While sorting the old tax documents he had carelessly left stacked on the desk, I discovered the final, irreversible piece of evidence that transformed the fraud from a financial scheme into a threat against my very autonomy. Tucked away between the 2021 mortgage statements was a document titled Durable Power of Attorney for Healthcare and Financial Decisions. It was meticulously prepared, witnessed and notarized, but the signature authorizing him to act on my behalf was a forgery, a chillingly accurate copy of my handwriting. The operative clause, highlighted in faint yellow marker, stipulated that the power was activated immediately upon my documented inability to manage affairs due to severe psychological distress or sudden, debilitating health crisis. This wasn't just about stealing money. This was about legal incapacitation. If he couldn't get the assets fast enough through divorce, he planned to medically or psychologically sideline me, using the very legal system I had trusted to protect me. He wasn't waiting 90 days for a clean break. He was preparing a hostile takeover of my life, potentially paving the way for a declaration of my incompetence to challenge the transfer of my separate premarital trust, the one asset he hadn't yet touched. The enemy wasn't just meticulous, he was ruthless, and he was planning to make me disappear legally before I could utter a single accusation. The realization that my survival hinged on maintaining perfect mental composure and avoiding even the smallest manufactured accident was the most terrifying burden I had ever carried. The silence in the penthouse was no longer the strained quiet of a tense marriage. It was the echoing vacuum of a war zone before the first shell lands. He had retreated entirely, using his late hours at the foundation as an excuse to avoid confrontation, but the real reason was the meticulous work happening behind locked doors. He had successfully isolated me further. The housekeeper had been replaced by a rotating service that answered only to his office, and my access to our shared accounts had been subtly restricted, disguised under a new complex security overhaul implemented by his new perpetually smiling financial consultant. I was a caged bird, trying desperately to sing a normal tune while observing the tightening wires. I maintained the charade of domestic bliss, cooking, reading the reports he left on the table, even inquiring about his foundation work, but every smile was a physical strain, every sentence a calculated deflection. My hands were shaking constantly, not from fear anymore, but from the effort of holding the facade steady. I knew I couldn't risk leaving the apartment to seek outside help. If I vanished for an hour, he would have the pretext he needed to call the emergency psychiatric assessment. My entire world had shrunk to the four walls of our gilded cage, and the only hope was finding the flaw in his perfect defense. The breakthrough came, ironically, because of his arrogance. He believed my digital illiteracy was absolute. Returning unexpectedly from a supposed charity gala, an event I declined, claiming a migraine, I noticed the faint chemical scent of toner hanging near the study door, which he always kept locked. He must have printed something hurriedly before leaving. The door itself was secured by a biometric lock tied to his thumbprint, but the auxiliary printer, a high-end model connected to the internal network, sat in the hallway closet. I remembered setting up that printer years ago and recalled a default manufacturer access code we never bothered to change, intended for maintenance overrides. My heart hammered against my ribs, sounding louder than the humming of the climate control. Fumbling the code combination, I finally accessed the printer's internal memory log. It wasn't the document itself, but the print queue history that hit me first, a file named waiver T38 final.pdf, followed by an obscure memo titled Dr. Albright Status Update, Urgent. Albright. Dr. Elias Albright was the leading expert in forensic psychiatry frequently used by the state in high-profile competency cases. The air went cold, and the pleasant smell of expensive wood polish suddenly felt like formaldehyde. I knew this was the one shot. I disabled the network connection to prevent a remote wipe, accessed the cache, and located the two files. The waiver was boilerplate, demanding I sign over medical power of attorney to him due to recent debilitating fatigue, an official document he was planning to spring on me. But the Albright memo was the poison. It was a bullet-point checklist, formatted as a legal consultation brief, detailing the specific fabricated symptoms required to meet the diagnostic criteria for early-onset delusional paranoia. Intermittent confusion regarding financial figures, obsessive focus on perceived external surveillance, and most damningly, recurrent references to physical harm originating from spousal unit. Below this, a final line, underlined and bolded, read assessment scheduled for 0900 hours next Tuesday. Ensure subject is fully isolated and mildly sedated 12 hours prior. Tuesday. That was 3 days away. The world tilted, not from panic, but from the sudden nauseating clarity. It wasn't just a plan, it was an executable timeline. He wasn't waiting for me to slip. He was manufacturing the environment for the final blow. The fear that had been a constant buzzing pressure in my skull suddenly vanished, replaced by an icy, precise mechanism of survival. I wasn't fighting for money anymore. I was fighting for my continued existence outside a state-run facility where I would be systematically silenced and medicated until my trust was fully liquidated. I returned the printer to its previous state, wiped the logs and locked the closet door. I walked back into the living room, smoothing my dress, arranging the coffee table, and ensuring the trembling in my hands did not reach my face. I looked at the glass wall overlooking the city lights, millions of people unaware of the silent execution planned for me 3 days hence. I had to disappear before Tuesday morning, but I couldn't simply run. Running would confirm the paranoia they were preparing to diagnose. I had to disappear legally, and I had to leave behind an explosive trail of evidence that would detonate the moment. He tried to claim I was unstable. The charade was over. My next move wouldn't be defensive, it had to be a preemptive strike, cold and surgical, before Dr. Albright walked through the door. If this story has resonated with the hidden battles you face, Perhaps you understand the moment when survival demands you become the hunter. The pre-dawn light was not a gentle transition. It was a clinical, harsh fluorescence reflecting off the polished marble of the floor. I stood by the door, not waiting for Dr. Albright, but waiting for the synchronized sequence I had scheduled hours earlier. My departure wouldn't be dramatic. It would be a silent, administrative vanishing act. At 5 a.m. precisely, the first encrypted packet hit the Board of Directors' secure server, detailing the unauthorized transfers, the fraudulent patient billing under Albright's name, and the final damning audio. Recording of his explicit plan to weaponize my psychiatric file. The second packet went to the regulatory body, anonymized and untraceable, a ticking bomb aimed straight at his medical license. I didn't want him jailed. I wanted him professionally annihilated, stripped of the power he had abused so carelessly. The silence that followed the digital trigger pull was heavier than any scream. I imagined the chaos unfolding miles away. The frantic, late-night calls, the sound of panicked keyboards, the sudden realization dawning on the supposed pillars of my family that the quiet victim they sought to neutralize had just dismantled their empire from within. There was no exhilaration, only a profound, cold emptiness. Justice, I discovered, feels less like triumph and more like amputation, necessary, brutal, and leaving behind a phantom ache where connection once existed. I had traded warmth for survival, and the cost was absolute solitude. I walked out of the house with one small bag containing essentials and the passport under my new legal name. The house, which had been the backdrop for 30 years of manufactured loyalty and simmering deception, felt suddenly porous, irrelevant. I left no note, only the meticulous paper trail that confirmed my mental acuity and legal competence, signed and notarized a week prior. When Dr. Albright eventually arrived, expecting to deliver a diagnosis and sign commitment papers, he would instead find a notice from my legal team stating that all assets were secured, all business ties dissolved, and that any attempt to breach my privacy would result in immediate legal action based on the evidence already distributed. The narrative was flipped. He was no longer the clinician judging the patient. He was the subject of an investigation, triggered by the person he thought he had already broken. It took weeks for the news to filter through the discreet channels of our social circles. My name was cleared, not through tearful defense, but through irrefutable financial data and irrefutable audio proof. The truth, when it finally surfaced, was a toxic wave that washed away the facade of the family's respectability. I learned in that painful aftermath that forgiveness is a luxury, afforded only to those who have the strength to rebuild without the ruins. I chose the latter. I didn't seek reconciliation or apology. The silence I maintained was my final and most potent act of justice. They were left with the wreckage of their reputation and the understanding that their greed had cost them the one person who had genuinely valued the idea of family, even when that value was cruelly misplaced. The path forward was steep and utterly devoid of familiar landmarks. I established myself in a city where my last name meant nothing, where my history was not a weapon to be used against me, but a silent scar that guided my decisions. I learned that the most dangerous lie we tell ourselves is believing that blood inherently dictates loyalty. It does not. Loyalty is a deliberate choice, an active commitment that, when absent, turns familial ties into the most efficient instruments of betrayal. I lost a past, a fortune, and a lifetime of expectations, but I gained a self I never knew existed, fierce, unyielding, and utterly free from the need for external validation. I now understand that the true battle is not against the people who hurt you, but against the narrative they try to impose on your reality. My fight was ultimately about reclaiming my mind, proving my sanity by taking the most drastic, logical step possible when cornered. Survival sometimes demands that you walk away from everything you knew, incinerating the bridges behind you so there is no temptation to return to the fire. If you have ever felt that cold certainty in your gut, the one that tells you the safest place is the furthest point possible from where you stand. If you've lived through that moment where self-preservation requires becoming the one thing they feared, unpredictable and fully autonomous, then you know the profound and isolating relief of finally choosing yourself. That knowledge is the only inheritance I needed.